At sunrise, when the glades begin to fade into the light, the Florida Everglades shimmers like a breathing mirror. It's a landscape of rippling sawgrass stretching over slow, drifting water, where herons stand motionless as carved stone. Yet beneath that breathtaking surface lies one of the most ravaged ecosystems on the entire continent. For decades, this sweeping wilderness, a shallow river of grass covering 1.5 million acres, has been enduring a quiet, coiling siege. The invader isn't a toxic spill or a construction project. It's breathing, it's feeding, and it has turned out to be, to say the least, impossible to stop. The Burmese python, a hunter native to the jungles of Southeast Asia, has effectively claimed Florida's wetlands as its own kingdom. What most people never hear is that this takeover wasn't nature's doing. It was a human error, rooted in the exotic pet trade of the 1980s and 90s. Baby pythons were marketed as harmless novelties, glossy, elegantly patterned, small enough to curl across a child's palms. But those little pets grew, and they did so rapidly. Within just a few years, many stretched to staggering lengths of 15 to 20 feet, strong enough to overpower a deer or wrestle down a 6-foot alligator. Owners, wholly unprepared for a massive reptile living in their home, began dumping them into nearby canals and swamps. Then, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida. The storm demolished countless reptile breeding operations, releasing an unknown number of pythons directly into the wild. Those escaped animals seeded the population that would eventually swallow the Everglades whole. For a python, this new territory was a paradise. The Everglades offered warmth, unlimited water, and above all, prey that had never learned to fear a massive constrictor. With no natural enemies of their own and an astonishing capacity to produce up to 100 eggs in a single clutch, their numbers exploded. Scientists now believe that tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, are moving through South Florida at any given moment. The damage they've inflicted on the food web is nothing short of catastrophic. In areas where pythons have taken hold, raccoons, opossums, and marsh rabbits have all but disappeared, populations down by more than 90%. One large python was discovered with a fully grown deer inside its belly. In another widely shared incident, a python was captured on camera, locked in combat with an alligator, a struggle so fierce that neither animal survived it. The disappearance of these species sets off a chain reaction. Fewer small mammals means less food for native birds of prey. Fewer scavengers means rotting matter accumulates, changing the very chemistry of the soil. The campaign against them has been long and largely unsuccessful. Authorities first appealed to the public, rolling out the Python Challenge in 2013. It was a major media spectacle, an open invitation for anyone bold enough to wade into the swamp. There were cash prizes, public recognition, and the raw excitement of the hunt. People arrived with airboats, machetes, and flashlights. But after weeks of searching, the combined total came to just 68 snakes. 68 out of tens of thousands. It was a publicity moment, not a genuine fix. Officials then shifted to a more serious approach, the Python Elimination Program. This wasn't a competition, it was paid work. Licensed hunters with proper credentials patrol the levees through the night, earning an hourly rate along with bonuses for every snake they bring in. But the numbers are punishing. Paying contractors to scour such an enormous territory costs millions of dollars. And so Florida officials quietly set a different plan into motion, pouring more millions into a last resort effort, releasing hundreds of robotic rabbits deep into the Everglades. Every machine was engineered to replicate a living rabbit, from its body warmth to its distinctive scent, all designed to lure in the pythons that have devastated the ecosystem. But the swamp doesn't play by human rules. The robots performed beyond expectations. They didn't only locate the pythons, they found something else entirely. And what unfolded after that is, honestly, extraordinary. And for every serpent they pull out, two more seem to show up in its place. They even tried something called Judas snakes, outfitting female pythons with radio trackers so they'd lead hunters straight to nesting sites. It helped a little, but not nearly enough. The Everglades was simply too vast. Authorities came to understand that raw force was a losing strategy. What they needed was a hunter that operated without relying on its eyes. From dead ends to early experiments, when the bounty programs failed to make any real difference, wildlife managers understood they had to find a completely different kind of hunter. They needed one that worked not on sight or chance, but on something ancient and deeply instinctual. That's when Florida reached for an ally, as old as human civilization itself, the dog. In recent years, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission launched a small but bold experiment. Two specially trained dogs, functioning like elite detectives, would be deployed into the wetlands to accomplish what people simply couldn't, tracking down what was invisible to the human eye. Their names were Truman and Eleanor. Truman was a black Labrador with the warm, approachable face of a household pet. Eleanor, a Dutch shepherd with keen, watchful eyes, had been bred for exactness. For months on end, both animals were trained to recognize the faint, musky odor that Burmese pythons leave behind. A scent completely undetectable to humans, yet one that lingers in the grass and mud long after the snake has moved on. Once the pair hit the field, results followed quickly. In just their first few months, they helped track down several large snakes that human crews had been unable to locate for weeks. Truman's tail would go rigid. Eleanor would sweep in low circles with her nose near the ground, and then she'd suddenly lock up and go still, the universal signal that something was close. Moments afterward, a handler's flashlight would catch the slow, rippling movement of scales. These two dogs were locating pythons in minutes, in places where biologists had spent hours searching. But just like everything else in the Everglades, that success came with a cost. The swamp is a brutal working environment. Temperatures are punishing, regularly climbing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with suffocating humidity. The dogs had to wear cooling vests and protective boots to keep their paws safe from the razor-edged sawgrass. And naturally, the area is loaded with other hazards, including alligators and venomous cottonmouth snakes. What most people failed to account for, though, was the real obstacle: scope. Truman and Eleanor were remarkable animals, but there were only two of them. The Everglades, after all, covers 1.5 million acres. To patrol that kind of terrain, the state would need hundreds of handler and dog teams, which would cost tens of millions of dollars in training and ongoing support. It was an exceptional tool, but it wasn't the complete answer. This success, however, raised a fresh and deeply controversial question. The dogs had confirmed that scent was the critical factor. So what if the hunters could lure the snakes directly to them? That line of thinking sent scientists down a troubling path, one where the boundary between science and desperation began to blur. They started with small, controlled experiments using live marsh rabbits, the python's natural prey in the wild. Secure enclosures were built specifically to shield the rabbits from any direct contact, and these were placed along heavily trafficked swampy trails. The rabbits, frightened but physically unharmed, acted as powerful magnets. Within a matter of weeks, pythons began appearing one by one, winding their way toward the enclosures. The concept was validated. Prey attraction was effective, but the ethical price was steep. Images of shaking live rabbits surrounded by enormous constrictors immediately ignited outrage among animal welfare organizations. The experiments were condemned as inhumane. Facing intense public backlash, the funding behind the live bait trials was cut off, and the entire program was shut down. They couldn't use living animals, so they made the decision to construct one instead. When the decoys entered the picture, the story takes a genuinely strange turn. With the live bait program behind them, engineers and biologists joined forces. They had the framework. They understood exactly what a python was drawn to: the warmth radiating from a small mammal, the smell of its fur, and the faint subtle movement that signals life. And so they got to work building. The initiative was known as the Robo-Rabbit. Every single decoy represented a triumph of functional engineering. Constructed from weather-resistant components and wrapped in synthetic fur, inside a specially designed thermal pad continuously emitted a heat signature almost indistinguishable from a living marsh rabbit's body temperature of 99 degrees. Tiny battery-operated emitters released a chemical blend that replicated rabbit musk, a scent capable of drifting across the swamp on a gentle breeze. Certain models even featured small motors that caused their ears and noses to twitch realistically. They were, in every practical sense, flawless bait. Each unit ran close to $4,000 to produce. Concealed inside was a motion-activated camera paired with a transmitter. Whenever something came slithering near, the system would wake up and fire off an alert to biologists stationed several miles away. Powering the whole setup were compact, efficient solar panels that kept the units running for weeks at a time. The strategy was straightforward. Teams anchored 120 of these robotic rabbits inside protective enclosures placed in known python territory. The objective wasn't to harm snakes outright, but to draw them into monitored areas where trained crews could move in and collect them. When the first units went live, nobody had any idea whether it would actually work. The opening 2 days were a breathtaking success. Alerts began pinging almost right away. Field cameras captured astonishing footage. Enormous pythons, some stretching beyond 15 feet in length, closing in on the decoys. They flickered their tongues, picking up the heat and the scent. Then they struck, wrapping their powerful bodies tightly around the artificial rabbits. Teams swept in and captured snake after snake. Everything was going according to plan. Then day 3 arrived. An alert came through from a decoy positioned near a deep water canal. The biologist monitoring the feed was expecting a python. Instead, the camera revealed a dark, log-shaped form moving rapidly, a 12-foot alligator. The gator wasn't disoriented. It had been drawn in by the exact same sensory cues. It perceived a warm, struggling creature. In one explosive burst of water, the alligator lunged at the enclosure and crushed the $4,000 machine in a single snap of its jaws. The robots, as it turned out, were the ideal lure for absolutely everything. What nobody had considered was that pythons and alligators are ancient rivals. They compete fiercely over both food and territory. Now, humans had essentially scattered hundreds of flashing dinner bells across their shared hunting grounds. What followed was the unbelievable part. A fresh predator conflict broke out. The alligators, having discovered that these contraptions were easy, if ultimately unsatisfying meals, began systematically hunting the robots. They demolished dozens of them. The pythons, meanwhile, detecting the presence of massive alligators nearby, began steering clear of the traps altogether. The project was, to state it plainly, an absolute failure. The program was collapsing, and the costly machines were being obliterated. But the robots were hiding a secret, hacking the invasion. Scientists and officials were on the verge of pulling the plug entirely. The robotic rabbit army had been defeated. Millions of dollars were literally being crushed between the jaws of alligators. But then a young data analyst working on the team spotted something unusual. The robots hadn't simply been decoys, they had been spies. Before each one was destroyed, its motion sensor, thermal imager, and camera had recorded everything that moved nearby. They weren't only cataloging python attacks, they were tracking python movements. They captured the time of day, the surrounding temperature, and the direction animals were traveling. What most people had overlooked was that by cross-referencing the data collected across all 120 units, particularly those that had never been attacked, a clear pattern began to surface. The team constructed a digital, three-dimensional map charting predator movement throughout the entire swamp. And what the data revealed was something nobody had ever observed before. The pythons weren't simply wandering aimlessly through the million-plus acres of wetland. They were following highways, specific concealed corridors, threading through the water and sawgrass, connecting one hunting ground to the next. And the alligators, it turned out, were using those same routes. And this is the point where everything stops feeling like science and starts feeling like something ripped straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. It only gets wilder from here. The scientists gathered every single piece of data they had collected, every twitch, every botched hunt, every demolished robotic rabbit, and fed it all into a powerful artificial intelligence system. The AI began tearing through those numbers, hunting for deep patterns that no human mind could ever detect. And it found one. It didn't just start predicting where the pythons were, it predicted where they would be at precise moments in time. How? Because it had figured out what the pythons were actually afraid of. The AI determined that the snakes were traveling in deliberate, calculated patterns specifically designed to avoid their one natural predator, the alligator. The robots hadn't simply located a handful of snakes. They had accidentally stumbled into something far bigger. Without meaning to, they had mapped out the python's entire hidden social schedule. They had cracked the code on their movements, their fears, and their secret routines. They had uncovered the python's greatest vulnerability. Armed with that brand new ghost map, the hunters completely overhauled their approach. The whole strategy changed in a single night. Gone were the days of sitting around at decoy locations, hoping a snake might happen to wander past. That method was finished. Instead, they used the AI's razor-sharp predictions to go on the attack. They could now cut the snakes off on their secret travel corridors, the concealed routes the pythons used when they believed no one was watching. The results came fast and were nothing short of jaw-dropping. They weren't coming across one snake at a time anymore. They were finding entire groups. The AI, by closely tracking the movements of large, mature females, did something nobody thought possible. It guided the hunters directly to the origin of the problem. It brought them straight to the breeding grounds. These were enormous, completely concealed nesting sites buried so deep in the swamp that no person would ever have stumbled upon them alone. Dozens of females were found, along with thousands upon thousands of eggs. The numbers were nearly impossible to believe. In just a single month of using this new AI-generated map, the hunters pulled more invasive pythons out of the Everglades than they had during the entire previous year of the bounty program. Every failure, every destroyed robot, all of it had been worth it. The robotic rabbits, even as they were being crushed underfoot, had succeeded beyond anything anyone had ever dared to imagine. They hadn't simply aided the fight. They had completely transformed the entire war. They had hacked the invasion itself. So, did Florida's cutting-edge experiment accidentally create a whole new generation of super snakes? What do you think the next move should be? Drop your thoughts in the comments down below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more unbelievable stories like this one.